Noah was a familiar face in the small, tight-knit town where he worked as a pizza delivery driver. With a warm smile and a knack for remembering names, he had built a quiet reputation for being dependable and kind. Among his regular customers, Mrs. Ellison, a sweet elderly woman who lived alone in a charming yet slightly run-down house at the end of Maple Street, held a special place in his heart. Every Thursday, like clockwork, she would place an order for her favorite, a medium veggie pizza with extra olives and a side of garlic bread. That Thursday evening, Noah glanced at the delivery list and frowned. Mrs. Ellison's name was missing. It wasn't like her to skip her weekly treat, and a twinge of concern crept into his thoughts. Maybe she just forgot, he muttered to himself. But the feeling lingered as he loaded the other orders into his car. As Noah drove through town, weaving past familiar landmarks and delivering piping hot pizzas, his mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Ellison. She was one of his most loyal customers, always greeting him with a warm smile and a small tip, even when times were tough. She often talked about her late husband and the garden they had lovingly tended together. It was hard to imagine her skipping their usual Thursday routine. By the time Noah had finished his last delivery for the evening, the concern had grown too strong to ignore. Something felt off. Making a quick decision, he turned his car toward Maple Street. Just a quick check, he reasoned. It wasn't in his job description, but Noah's instincts told him he needed to make sure Mrs. Ellison was okay. When he pulled up to her house, he immediately noticed something unusual. The porch light, which was always on to welcome visitors, was dark. The house seemed eerily quiet, and the curtains were drawn shut. Noah felt a chill run down his spine as he parked and hesitated for a moment before stepping out. As he approached the front door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Noah knocked on Mrs. Ellison's door, his knuckles echoing against the quiet of the night. He waited, glancing nervously around the dimly lit porch. No answer. He tried again, this time calling out softly, "Mrs. Ellison. It's Noah, the pizza guy. Just checking in on you." Still no response. A tight knot formed in his stomach. He reached for his phone, debating whether to call someone. But who? Her family? The police? Before he could decide, something caught his eye, a small, crumpled envelope lying just off the edge of the doormat. Curious, Noah bent down to pick it up. The envelope was addressed to "Anyone who cares" in shaky handwriting that he instantly recognized as Miss Ellison's. His heart sank as he opened it and began to read. "To whoever finds this. Life has been kind to me, but loneliness has a way of creeping into your bones, especially when you're old and forgotten. I haven't been feeling well lately, and I'm not sure how much longer I'll be here. If anyone reads this, please don't let the garden go to waste. It was my late husband's pride and joy. Take care of it for him. With love. Miss Ellison." Noah's hands trembled as he finished reading. The words struck him like a blow, heavy with an unspoken cry for help. He knew he couldn't walk away. Steeling himself, he tried the doorknob. To his relief, it wasn't locked. "Mrs. Ellison?" he called out again, stepping cautiously into the dimly lit living room. The house felt colder than it should have been, and the faint scent of lavender hung in the air, a reminder of her favorite candle. He found her in her recliner, bundled in a quilt, her head tilted to one side. For a heart-stopping moment, Noah feared the worst. But then he noticed the soft rise and fall of her chest. She was breathing, though barely. Relief flooded over him, quickly replaced by urgency. "Mrs. Ellison, wake up," he said gently, kneeling beside her. She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open. Her gaze was unfocused, but she recognized him almost immediately. "Noah," she whispered, her voice weak. "I didn't think anyone would come." "You don't have to worry about that," he said firmly, gripping her frail hand. "I'm here. Let's get you some help." Without wasting another second, Noah called for an ambulance. As he stayed by her side, waiting for help to arrive, Mrs. Ellison gave his hand a faint squeeze. "Thank you," she murmured, tears glistening in her eyes. In that moment, Noah realized how much a simple act of care could mean, and as the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence, he silently vowed to make sure Mrs. Ellison would never feel forgotten again. The next morning, Noah sat in the hospital waiting room, clutching a cup of lukewarm coffee. The events of the previous night played over in his mind, the ambulance arriving, the paramedics carrying Miss Ellison on a stretcher, her fragile smile as she whispered, "Take care of the garden, Noah." A nurse finally approached him. "She's stable. the nurse said with a reassuring smile. Severe dehydration and exhaustion, but nothing we can't manage. She'll need rest and someone to check on her regularly. Relief washed over Noah, but it was quickly replaced by a nagging question: who would check on her? Mrs. Ellison had mentioned once, during one of their doorstep conversations, that she had no close family left. Noah realized, with a pang of sadness, that she had been truly alone. Leaving the hospital, he decided to take a walk to clear his head. The early morning air was crisp, and his footsteps echoed down the empty street. By the time he reached Mrs. Ellison's house, an idea had started to form in his mind. He stood in the front yard, surveying the neglected garden. The flower beds were overrun with weeds, and the once beautiful roses had withered. Yet beneath the disarray, Noah saw potential, a glimpse of the vibrant life the garden had once held. He pulled out his phone and opened the group chat he had with his closest friends. Typing quickly, he wrote, "Hey everyone, I need a favor. There's an elderly lady who lives alone, and she's been through a rough time. Her garden was her husband's pride and joy, but it's fallen into disrepair. I want to fix it up for her. Who's in?" The responses came almost immediately. "Count me in. I've got some tools. When do we start? I can bring plants." Noah smiled. He had no idea if his friends shared his connection with Miss Ellison, but their willingness to help reminded him that kindness often inspired more kindness. The following weekend, a group of them arrived at Mrs. Ellison's house armed with shovels, gloves, and enough enthusiasm to rival a home improvement show. They worked tirelessly, pulling weeds, trimming hedges, and planting new flowers. A friend with a knack for landscaping suggested adding a small bird feeder, and another brought over a bench they had refurbished. As the hours passed, the garden began to transform. The wild chaos was replaced by neat rows of blooming flowers, freshly laid mulch, and a sense of peace. Noah couldn't help but imagine Miss Ellison's reaction when she saw it. That evening, as they packed up, Noah looked around at what they had accomplished. It wasn't just a garden anymore, it was a sanctuary. A place that reflected love and care. He felt a swell of pride but knew the work wasn't done. Before leaving, Noah left a note on Mrs. Ellison's kitchen table, along with the envelope she had written. "Dear Mrs. Ellison, your garden is ready for you, just like your husband would have wanted. We'll check in on you regularly, but until then, rest up and come back stronger. You're not alone anymore. With love, Noah and friends." As he closed the door behind him, Noah realized that what they had done wasn't just about flowers or weeds, it was about giving Miss Ellison a reason to smile, a reminder that she mattered, and a reassurance that people cared. A few days later, Mrs. Ellison was discharged from the hospital. Noah offered to pick her up, and although she initially hesitated, she eventually agreed. As he helped her into his car, he noticed how frail she seemed but also how her eyes sparkled with gratitude. "Thank you, Noah," she said softly, "for everything." "You'll see, Mrs. Ellison," he replied with a smile. "The best is yet to come." The short drive back to her house was filled with light conversation. Noah avoided mentioning the garden, wanting it to be a surprise. As they pulled into the driveway, Miss Ellison gasped. The once overgrown yard had been transformed into a vibrant, colorful masterpiece. Rows of blooming roses lined the walkway, and fresh marigolds and petunias danced in the gentle breeze. The bird feeder hung from a sturdy oak tree, already attracting sparrows, while the newly added bench offered a perfect spot to sit and enjoy the view. Mrs. Ellison opened the car door with trembling hands, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Noah, how?" Noah chuckled and shrugged. "It wasn't just me. A few friends wanted to help. We thought you might like to see the garden come alive again." Tears welled up in her eyes as she took tentative steps toward the flowers. She knelt down despite Noah's protests and gently ran her fingers over the soft petals of a rose. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "He would have loved this." She stood slowly, wiping her tears, and turned to Noah. "I thought I'd lost it all, my garden, my joy, even my connection to the world. But you brought it all back. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Noah said sincerely. "It's the least we could do. And you're not alone anymore. We're here for you, Mrs. Ellison." Over the next few weeks, the garden became a symbol of renewal, not just for Mrs. Ellison, but for the entire neighborhood. Neighbors stopped by to admire the transformation, sharing stories and laughter over cups of tea on the new bench. Children played near the flower beds, careful not to disturb the plants, while sparrows and finches made the bird feeder their new home. For Mrs. Ellison, the garden was more than just a collection of flowers. It was a reminder of love and community, a sign that she hadn't been forgotten. She began to spend her mornings tending to the plants and her evenings sitting on the bench, often joined by Noah or one of his friends. One day, as they sat together in the golden light of the sunset, Mrs. Ellison turned to Noah and said, "You've given me more than a garden, Noah. You've given me hope." Noah smiled, his heart full. "I think we gave each other something, Miss Ellison." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the garden stood as a testament to the power of compassion, proving that even in the darkest times, a little kindness could bring life and color back to the world. Miss Ellison's garden became the beating heart of the neighborhood, a gathering place where people came together to celebrate life and support one another. But the impact of Noah's kindness and Mrs. Ellison's rejuvenation didn't stop there. It began to ripple outward, inspiring others in ways no one could have predicted. One sunny Saturday morning, Mrs. Ellison hosted her first ever community garden day. She invited neighbors, old and new, to spend a few hours planting flowers, exchanging seeds, and sharing gardening tips. Noah helped her set up a small table with lemonade and cookies, while other neighbors brought extra plants or tools. "I never knew so many people cared about gardening," Mrs. Ellison said with a laugh as she handed a young boy a packet of sunflower seeds. "It's not just the gardening," Noah replied with a grin. "It's you. You've brought everyone together." The event was a resounding success. Children laughed as they dug into the soil, parents exchanged stories of their own gardens, and elderly residents shared wisdom on how to care for different plants. By the end of the day, the garden was bursting with new life: bright daisies, fragrant lavender, and even a small vegetable patch planted near the back. Word of the garden spread beyond the neighborhood. A local newspaper ran a feature titled "The Garden That Grew a Community," highlighting Miss Ellison's story and Noah's efforts. The article resonated with readers across the city, and soon, letters began arriving at Mrs. Ellison's home. One letter came from a widower who wrote, "Your story reminded me of my late wife's love for roses. I've decided to start tending to her old garden again. Thank you for inspiring me." Another letter came from a young woman who had been feeling isolated in a new city. "I started volunteering at a community garden after reading about yours," she wrote. "It's brought me so much joy and connection." Mrs. Ellison read each letter with tears in her eyes, sharing them with Noah when he visited. "I never thought something so small could matter to so many," she said one afternoon. "It's not small," Noah said gently. "You've shown people what's possible when we look out for each other. That's huge." Inspired by the response, Mrs. Ellison decided to host weekly tea sessions in her garden, open to anyone who needed company or a quiet place to reflect. She called them moments of peace. The sessions became a sanctuary for people dealing with loneliness, grief, or simply the need for connection. Among the regular attendees was a retired teacher who had been hesitant to join at first. One day she confided in Mrs. Ellison, saying, "This garden gave me the courage to leave my house after months of feeling lost. It's like a lifeline." Noah, too, found himself changed by the experience. Helping Mrs. Ellison had sparked a passion for community service, and he started organizing similar projects around the city. He worked with volunteers to clean up abandoned lots, plant trees, and create green spaces in areas that needed them most. As the seasons changed, so did the garden. Winter brought a quiet beauty, with frosted branches and carefully wrapped plants waiting for spring. But even then, the garden remained a beacon of warmth, a place where Mrs. Ellison's new friends gathered to share stories and hot cocoa around a small fire pit Noah had built. Years later, as Mrs. Ellison sat on the garden bench surrounded by blooming flowers and laughter, she reflected on how her world had transformed. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a young man mowing her lawn, had grown into something far greater. Her once lonely house had become a home filled with love, laughter, and life. And her garden, once overgrown and forgotten, had blossomed into a symbol of hope, proving that no matter how dark life might seem, kindness and community could bring light back into the world. As Noah visited her one evening, Mrs. Ellison turned to him with a smile and said, "You were right, Noah. The best was yet to come." And as they watched the sunset over the garden, they knew that the seeds of kindness they had planted would continue to grow, touching lives in ways they couldn't even imagine. Years passed, and the small community garden that Mrs. Ellison had nurtured with Noah became an iconic symbol of kindness, connection, and the power of a single act to change the course of many lives. The once quiet street, filled with neighbors who barely knew one another, had transformed into a vibrant community where people greeted each other with warm smiles and knew each other's names. The garden had grown, too, into something much larger than anyone could have predicted. One chilly autumn morning, Mrs. Ellison stood at the garden's entrance, a peaceful smile on her face as she admired the golden leaves floating gently from the trees. Noah, now in his 30s, stood beside her, the two of them looking over the community that had flourished as a result of their shared dream. "I never imagined this," Mrs. Ellison murmured. "When I first started, I thought it was just about the flowers." "And now?" Noah asked, his voice full of pride. "Now it's about everything," she said softly. "It's about the people we've brought together, the lives we've changed. The flowers, yes, but more than that, the friendships, the memories, the healing." Noah smiled, but his eyes were full of reflection. He had grown so much since those early days. He had taken the lessons learned from Mrs. Ellison's garden and poured them into his own life, building stronger relationships and encouraging others to look beyond their own struggles to offer help. Through his efforts, the ripple of kindness that had started with a single act mowing Mrs. Ellison's lawn had grown into a movement. His organization now partnered with local schools, senior centers, and businesses to create green spaces, host community events, and provide resources for families in need. The most important part of his mission, however, was sharing Miss Ellison's story, as a reminder that small acts of kindness could lead to extraordinary change. One afternoon, Mrs. Ellison received a letter that moved her deeply. It came from a young woman named Ella, who had heard about the garden through a charity event. Ella's letter was full of gratitude, and she wrote, "Your garden inspired me to start a project in my own town. My goal is to plant gardens in every neighborhood, so that no one has to feel alone. You've made me believe that one person can make a difference." The letter made Mrs. Ellison smile, knowing that her own journey had sparked something much larger than she could have ever imagined. As the years continued to unfold, Mrs. Ellison found herself less active in the daily upkeep of the garden. But the legacy she had created continued to thrive. The garden had taken on a life of its own, with younger generations caring for it, adding new touches, and even starting their own community projects inspired by the principles of unity and compassion that had once been instilled in them. Noah now stood in front of a community center built right next to Miss Ellison's garden. The center had been named in her honor, the Ellison Community Hub. It was a place where the elderly found support, children attended after-school programs, and anyone in need of a helping hand could find it. On the day of the grand opening, Noah stood with Mrs. Ellison as a plaque with her name was unveiled. It read, "In honor of a woman who taught us the power of kindness, the importance of community, and the strength found in every small act." The crowd, made up of neighbors and strangers who had been touched by her story, clapped in appreciation. Mrs. Ellison wiped away a tear as she looked at the people around her life, her mission, her legacy now intertwined with so many others. "I didn't do it alone," she whispered to Noah, her voice full of emotion. "None of this would have happened without you." Noah smiled, squeezing her hand. "You taught me everything I know about kindness, Mrs. Ellison. This is your legacy." In the years that followed, the garden and the community center became a destination for visitors from around the world, all wanting to experience the magic that had blossomed from the simple, selfless act of one person helping another. And although Mrs. Ellison had grown older, she remained a cornerstone of the neighborhood, always ready with a story, a smile, and a gentle reminder of what true community meant. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Mrs. Ellison sat alone on the familiar bench, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought back to those dark, lonely days when she hadn't known if she could go on, when the weight of the world had seemed too heavy. But now, as the cool breeze rustled through the leaves, she realized how far she had come, and how far the seeds of kindness she had planted had spread. Her heart swelled with contentment, knowing that her legacy would live on long after she was gone. The garden, the center, the relationships, the stories, they would all continue, growing stronger with every passing year. She had taught them all that kindness was never small, it was the biggest thing in the world. And for that, she was grateful. As the years rolled on, the small community garden that had once been a mere idea grew to be a symbol of hope, strength, and compassion. Mrs. Ellison, now in her twilight years, continued to watch over the space with the same warmth and dedication that had marked her earlier days. Yet, as much as she loved the garden, she knew that her time to take a step back was nearing. It wasn't an easy decision. She had poured her heart and soul into the garden, and the thought of stepping away was difficult. But she also knew that for her legacy to live on, it needed to be passed on to someone else, someone who would continue her mission and guide the garden into the future. One afternoon, as she sat on the bench that overlooked the vibrant flowers and laughing children, Noah approached her. He had been busy with his own projects, but had always stayed close, checking in regularly to make sure everything was going well. "Mrs. Ellison," Noah said gently, sitting down beside her. "I think it's time." She turned to him, her eyes soft but filled with understanding. "Time for what, Noah?" "Time for me to take over," he said, his voice full of respect. "I've learned everything I can from you, and I'm ready to carry the torch." For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the garden. The flowers, the trees, the people, all of it was a part of her. But Noah was right. It was time to let go and let someone else take the reins. "You've been like a son to me," Mrs. Ellison said after a long pause. "I trust you with all my heart. You know this garden inside and out. You understand what it means, not just for the people who come here, but for the world beyond." Noah smiled, a tear in his eye. "Thank you. I'll make you proud." Mrs. Ellison nodded, standing up with some difficulty. She reached for Noah's hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "You already have, Noah, you already have." And with that, she began to step back, her time at the garden slowly fading into the background as Noah took his place as the new heart and soul of the community garden. Years passed, and Noah not only kept Miss Ellison's vision alive but also expanded it. He introduced new programs, created spaces for educational workshops, and established partnerships with local schools, businesses, and other organizations. The garden had blossomed beyond anyone's expectations, drawing people from near and far. Noah took the time to share Mrs. Ellison's story at every opportunity, ensuring that people knew who had started it all. He talked about the importance of kindness, of taking time to care for one another, and of finding hope in the simplest things, like planting a seed and watching it grow. The garden had become not just a place of beauty, but a sanctuary for many. Some came to find peace, others to escape the noise of the world, and still more to form bonds that would last a lifetime. One day, as Noah was walking through the garden, he came across a group of teenagers planting flowers in a newly cleared area. He approached them, smiling warmly. "How's the planting going?" he asked. "Great," one of them replied. "This is the first time we've done something like this, but it feels amazing to be a part of something bigger than ourselves." Noah nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "You're part of something very special. This garden has been a place of transformation for so many people, and now you're adding to its story." The teenagers looked at him, some confused, others intrigued. "This garden was started by a woman named Mrs. Ellison," Noah continued. "She believed in the power of kindness, in small acts that lead to big changes. She passed the torch to me, but it's up to all of us to keep it going." The kids looked at each other, sensing the depth of what he was saying. They were now part of a bigger story, one that stretched beyond just the flowers in front of them. As time went on, the community garden became a hub for those who wanted to make a difference. People from all walks of life contributed their time, ideas, and love, and as the garden grew, so did the community's sense of togetherness. The legacy that Mrs. Ellison had created had taken root in so many hearts, and it continued to flourish under Noah's leadership. One afternoon, years after Mrs. Ellison had passed, the community gathered to celebrate what had become an annual event, the Ellison Day. It was a day of remembrance, celebration, and giving back to the community that had helped shape the garden into what it was. There were speeches, performances, and a great feast, but the most important part of the day was the planting of a new tree. Noah stood in front of the crowd, his eyes misty as he spoke. "Today we plant this tree in honor of Mrs. Ellison. Her vision, her love, her commitment to kindness lives on in each of us. This tree will stand as a reminder of how one person can change the world." As the tree was carefully placed in the ground, the community stood together, united by the legacy of a woman who had taught them the true power of love, kindness, and community. Noah, now older and wiser, took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all that had been accomplished. He looked around at the faces of the people who had been touched by Mrs. Ellison's dream, faces filled with hope, determination, and love. And in that moment he knew that the garden, and all it represented, would continue to grow for generations to come. It had become more than just a garden, it had become a living testament to the power of one person to make a difference. The torch had been passed, and it would never go out. The years continued to pass, and the garden, once just a simple patch of land, had become a landmark in the community. It was a place where people came to heal, to grow, and to connect. It had transcended its original purpose as a community garden, and had blossomed into something more profound, a symbol of unity, hope, and resilience. Noah, now in his late 50s, had seen it all: the challenges, the triumphs, and the quiet moments of reflection as people gathered to tend to the land. He had led the garden through difficult times, weathered storms both literal and figurative, and had been the steady hand that guided it forward. He often found himself standing in the center of the garden, looking around at the thriving plants and the people who walked through it. But there was something special about this year. It felt different, as if the garden was at the brink of something even greater. One crisp autumn morning, Noah received a letter. It was from the city council, informing him that the garden had been nominated for a prestigious community award. The recognition was not just for the garden itself, but for the way it had transformed the lives of so many people over the years. The letter stated that the garden had become a model for community-driven change and had earned the admiration of local and national organizations alike. Noah couldn't believe it. The garden was about to be recognized on a much larger scale. But as he read the letter over and over, one thought kept echoing in his mind. This was not just his achievement, it was Miss Ellison's. It was her vision, her heart, and her unwavering belief in the power of people coming together. He knew that he couldn't accept this honor alone. The garden had been built by countless hands, many of whom had passed through it over the years. It was their sweat, their tears, and their love that had cultivated the garden into what it had become. So, he made the decision to share the recognition with all who had contributed, from the youngest child who planted their first flower to the elderly volunteer, who had been coming every week since the garden first opened. At the award ceremony, Noah stood on stage, looking out at the crowd. There were leaders from various organizations, families who had been a part of the garden for years, and a few local politicians who had supported the initiative from the start. When Noah took the microphone, he paused for a moment to gather his thoughts. He had done plenty of public speaking over the years, but this moment felt different. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about the garden, even though the garden was the heart of everything. This moment was about something much larger. "Thank you," Noah began, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "This honor is not just for me. It's for all of us who believed in this vision. It's for Mrs. Ellison, who started it all. Without her, we wouldn't be here today. She showed us that one person, armed with nothing but kindness and love, could change the world. And we have all been the beneficiaries of her hard work, her faith, and her belief in us." The crowd sat in quiet reverence, many people nodding in agreement, some wiping tears from their eyes. Noah's words had struck a chord, because they all knew that the garden was not just a physical place, it was a living legacy. "We are the garden," Noah continued. "Each of us is a seed that has been nurtured and grown here. And just as we tend to the plants, we tend to each other. The garden is a reflection of our love, our struggles, our successes. It is a reminder that when we come together as a community, we are unstoppable." He paused again, his gaze shifting to the audience. "This award, this recognition, belongs to each of you. To every person who has ever planted a seed, shared a smile, or offered a hand to someone in need. It's because of you that this garden thrives. And it's because of you that Miss Ellison's dream continues to grow." As Noah finished his speech, the room erupted into applause. But even as the crowd cheered, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. The garden had taken on a life of its own, and its legacy would continue to thrive, not because of the award or the recognition, but because of the people who believed in it and in each other. In the years that followed, the garden continued to flourish. It expanded into new areas, bringing in new generations of volunteers and community members. The garden had become an educational space, teaching children about the environment, sustainability, and the importance of giving back to the community. It was also a gathering place for events, local festivals, celebrations, and even weddings, where couples chose the garden as the backdrop for their vows. But perhaps the most profound change was the way the garden became a place of refuge for people in times of hardship. Families facing loss, individuals battling illness, and people going through personal struggles found solace in the quiet peace of the garden. It had become a sanctuary, a reminder that in the face of adversity, growth was still possible. One spring day, as Noah walked through the garden, he stopped in front of the tree planted in Miss Ellison's honor. It had grown tall and strong, its branches reaching toward the sky. "Thank you," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Thank you for everything." And as he stood there, surrounded by the life and beauty that had bloomed because of her, he knew that the garden's legacy would never fade. It would continue to grow, just as the seeds she had planted in people's hearts had blossomed into a community that would carry her spirit for generations to come. The garden was more than just a place, it was a living testament to the power of love, hope, and the belief that together, anything was possible. As the years rolled on, the once quiet community garden became a beacon of transformation for a new generation. The garden, now a staple of the neighborhood, had not only provided a space for growth, but had also woven itself into the fabric of the community's daily life. It had become a place where children played, elders shared stories, and young adults found purpose. The legacy of Mrs. Ellison and Noah had firmly planted its roots, and the garden was thriving more than ever. The new generation of volunteers, students, and young families had come to appreciate the garden in ways that the older community members had never imagined. The garden's mission had expanded beyond just planting and harvesting. It had evolved into a cultural hub. School groups visited frequently, eager to learn about the environment, sustainability, and the importance of community service. For many of these children, the garden was their first real introduction to the beauty of nature and the power of collective effort. Noah, who had devoted his life to the garden, had begun to slow down in recent years. His gray hair had turned silver, and his movements were less swift than they once were. But his spirit remained as strong as ever. He knew that the time was fast approaching when he would need to pass on the responsibility of caring for the garden. He had long felt that it was important to give the next generation the tools and the love for the garden, just as Mrs. Ellison had passed them on to him. One of the young volunteers who had spent much time at the garden was Emma, a recent college graduate with a passion for horticulture and community outreach. She had started as an intern, volunteering during her summer breaks, and had quickly become a leader within the garden. Emma was smart, enthusiastic, and deeply connected to the garden's mission. She was always ready to pitch in, whether it was leading a school group through a lesson about planting vegetables or organizing community events. One day, as the fall leaves began to color the sky in vibrant reds and oranges, Noah called Emma to the small wooden bench by the old oak tree, the one where he had so often sat with Mrs. Ellison to reflect on the garden's progress. It was a quiet moment, one that seemed to hold the weight of years gone by. "Emma, I've been thinking about the future of this garden," Noah began, his voice still strong but carrying the weight of his years. "I can't keep running things forever. I think it's time for someone else to take the lead." Emma's eyes widened, her heart tightening. She had known this moment would come eventually, but hearing Noah say it out loud felt like a bittersweet turning point. "I understand, Noah," she said, her voice full of emotion, "but I don't think I could ever replace you. You've been the heart and soul of this place for so long. I'm not sure if I'm ready." Noah smiled warmly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're ready, Emma. More than ready. You've got the passion, the drive, and the love for this garden. You know its roots better than anyone. You've been with us through thick and thin. It's time for you to step up and continue what we started." Emma felt a mix of pride and fear. She had seen the impact the garden had on the community. She had witnessed the way it brought people together, helped families heal, and made children's eyes light up when they saw their first tomato grow. But she also knew the responsibility that came with this legacy. Over the next few months, Emma worked closely with Noah, learning the ins and outs of managing the garden. He taught her about the history of the garden, the challenges they had faced over the years, and the key relationships they had built with the community. Noah entrusted her with the keys to the garden shed, the budgets, and even the task of organizing community events. He wanted to ensure that Emma had everything she needed to carry the garden into the next era. By the time the first frost of winter touched the garden, it was clear to everyone that the garden had a new leader. Emma's passion for the space was undeniable, and her ability to connect with people, young and old alike, made her the perfect person to continue the work that had started so many years ago. Noah, while stepping back, still remained involved in the garden's affairs. He took on the role of an advisor, offering guidance when needed but giving Emma the room to make her own decisions. He trusted her to continue the garden's mission, knowing that it was in good hands. The garden flourished under Emma's leadership. She expanded its outreach, incorporating programs to help those in need, especially during the cold winter months. She partnered with local businesses to provide fresh produce to food banks and organized free gardening workshops for families. The once quiet plot of land had now become a thriving community center, one that had grown into something even greater than anyone had imagined. Emma's work was deeply fulfilling, but she never forgot the lessons Noah had taught her. Every decision she made was grounded in the same principles that had guided the garden for years: unity, service, and love. She honored Mrs. Ellison's memory by continuing to cultivate the garden with the same care and compassion that had started it all. As the years passed, Emma watched the next generation of children grow up alongside the garden. They learned the value of hard work, the importance of community, and the power of nature. The garden was no longer just a place for people to come and take, it was a place for people to give back. It had become a tradition, a legacy that continued to shape the hearts of all who were touched by it. And one spring day, as Emma sat under the old oak tree, surrounded by blooming flowers and the laughter of children, she realized that the garden's roots had spread far beyond its physical boundaries. It had planted itself deeply in the hearts of those who had cared for it. And now, more than ever, it was a symbol of everything that was possible when a community came together. She smiled, knowing that Mrs. Ellison's dream had not only survived, it had thrived, passed down to a new generation that would continue to nurture it for years to come. Years passed, and the garden continued to flourish, not just as a physical space, but as a living, breathing testament to the power of community and the bonds it forged. Emma, now a leader in her own right, looked back at the journey that had brought her here, and it amazed her how far the garden had come from its humble beginnings. It was no longer just a plot of land where vegetables were grown, it had become the heart of the community, a place where people came together to work, share, learn, and grow. But the true legacy of the garden was not in its rows of plants or the bountiful harvests it produced. It was in the lives it touched. It was in the families that had been brought closer, the children who learned the value of hard work and compassion, and the elderly who found solace and purpose tending to the soil. It was in the neighbors who once barely exchanged a hello, now working side by side, sharing stories and meals. The garden had brought a level of unity to the community that was beyond what anyone could have imagined when it was first created. One day, Emma was invited to speak at a local community meeting. The topic was the future of the neighborhood, and the room was full of people from all walks of life. As she stood at the front of the room, Emma couldn't help but think about the garden. She'd been nervous when she first took over the leadership role, unsure if she was ready to carry the mantle. But now, as she spoke about the impact the garden had on the community, she realized just how far she had come. The garden had not only shaped her, but it had shaped everyone in the community. And as she shared her story with the room, she knew it was a story worth telling. "I think," Emma began, her voice steady but full of emotion, "that the greatest thing the garden has done is bring us all together. It's not just a place for us to grow food. It's a place for us to grow as a community. When we work side by side, when we share our successes and failures, we become more than just neighbors, we become a family." The room fell silent, everyone listening intently. Emma could see the faces of those who had spent countless hours working in the garden, their hands stained with soil and their hearts full of pride. She saw the smiles of children who had once helped plant the first seeds, now grown and contributing in their own ways. "We've all learned something here," she continued, "about patience, about resilience, about what it means to take care of each other. The garden has been a place of healing, a place of hope." As Emma finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. The community had come to understand that the garden was not just a physical space, it was a living entity that would continue to evolve, just as they had. And with that realization, the community felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. to ensure that the garden's legacy would live on for generations to come. The garden had become a model for other neighborhoods, a shining example of how a simple idea could turn into something much bigger. Emma had seen firsthand how the garden had transformed not just the neighborhood, but also herself. She had learned that leadership was not about control or power, it was about service, about listening to the needs of others, and about trusting the community to take ownership of something greater than themselves. As the sun began to set that evening, casting a warm golden glow over the garden, Emma sat on the same wooden bench where she had once shared a quiet conversation with Noah. The garden was peaceful, a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves of the old oak tree. She closed her eyes for a moment, reflecting on all that had been accomplished and all that was yet to come. She thought of Mrs. Ellison, who had started it all, and of Noah, who had trusted her to continue the work. She thought of the children who had learned to plant their first seeds, and of the elderly who had found new purpose tending the garden. And she thought of the future of the children, who would grow up with the garden as a backdrop to their lives, and of the new generations who would carry the torch forward. The garden was no longer just a project, it was a movement. It had grown into something far greater than anyone had ever envisioned. It had become a symbol of what could be accomplished when people came together with a shared purpose, and it would continue to grow, bloom, and thrive, just as the community had. Emma smiled to herself, knowing that the garden's roots had taken hold deep within the hearts of everyone who had been a part of it, and as long as there were people to care for it, the garden would never stop growing. It would always be a place of connection, of growth, and of legacy. And in that moment, she knew that the work she had started, and the community that had built it, would continue for generations to come. The garden was a living legacy, one that would never fade.